In this video, we're going to talk about how to heal trauma. In our last video, I spent some time with you to understand what trauma is, looking at this definition and the signs and the symptoms of trauma. Now I want to talk more specifically of how you can bring healing to those that are traumatized that you're ministering to, as well as perhaps yourself. The key to healing trauma is for the traumatized person to tell their trauma story. Because it has been repressed, the trauma story affects the rest of the person's life, creating this disorder we talked about in the last video. And so in order to be free of those behaviors, characteristics, beliefs, that story needs to come out. Now, this is something a person will resist. Let me be direct with you, right? Because it's painful. It's painful to tell the story. Think of yourself. I don't know if you've ever had a boil on your skin and how painful it is. And you're trying to endure the pain, but you go to the doctor and the doctor takes out his little scalpel, and you know exactly what the doctor is going to tell you. If you want that pain to go away, I have to lance your boil. We have to get all that pus and poison out of there, and it's going to hurt, but later you'll feel better. And if you're like me, I'm going to look at the doctor, see that little scalpel, and say, "It's okay, doc, I'm fine. Don't worry about it, I can handle it." And I'm going to leave, because I don't want to feel that pain. But it's not going to go away, is it? Until eventually I get up the courage to go back to the doctor and say, "Do what you have to do." So a person who's traumatized has a wound that is a boil, full of emotional toxins, that to be healed needs to be lanced. And it's lanced by that individual telling their trauma story. Now, to tell that trauma story requires the healer to be a particular kind of person with particular understandings and giftedness. For example, that healer has to be trustworthy. They have to convince that traumatized person whatever comes out in that trauma story is between you, them, and God. And you will never, ever, ever tell anyone about their story without their permission. Because people will not tell their story if they think you're going to tell that story to your husband, to your wife, to your friend, to someone else, because they don't feel safe with you. For the traumatized person to tell their trauma story, they need to feel safe. And you as the healer have to do something in some way to convince them you're a safe person. You do that by first of all informing them you're not there to judge them, you're not there to criticize them, and you will never ever tell their story to anyone else without their permission. You're there to listen, and not listen as many of us listen for how we want to answer and say what we want to say, but listen just to them tell their story. One of the characteristics about Jesus, if you read the Gospels, is he was an excellent listener. That's why he asked questions. He would ask questions of people because he wanted to listen to their heart. And so this person needs to be safe with you so they will listen. Now, there are 4 parts to healing traumatized person as they tell their trauma story. The first part is to educate. Most people are not very well educated on what trauma is. They think there's something wrong with them, particularly if they're a Christian. They may think God's punishing me because of some sin. They may think that there's something wrong with them, that maybe they're weak in their faith, that they don't have enough faith in God to believe in him. They can have all kinds of distortions about trauma. And so they need to be educated, as we talked about last time. And if you're in our level 1 training, you get more extensive training. But to convince that person to understand that trauma or PTSD is a medical diagnosis. It has nothing to do with their character. It has nothing to do with what they did. Unlike other problems we have in life that comes out of us. It comes because of something we've done in us. The person is traumatized, if you remember the definition. The thing has happened to them. It comes from outside of them. The gunfire, the tsunami, the earthquake. This is not something that's coming from inside the person. It's something that comes from outside and is affected them. That's why they don't have a mental problem. They don't have a spiritual problem. They have a clearly diagnosed medical problem of being traumatized that God wants to heal. And so they need to be educated first. Secondly, they will need to be exposed in some way when they tell their trauma story to re-experience the trauma so that as they do so, they can see it differently and be healed of the negative effects of that trauma. Now, if you're in our level 1 and 2 extensive trainings we give to our healers, we'll talk quite a bit in depth of how exposure can work. But just for now, for a basic understanding, for healing to occur, the trauma, the effects of the traumatic event has to be exposed. Thirdly, to examine. Often when a person has a trauma story and it has been unexpressed and unhealed, they have a distortion of beliefs and opinions. Let me give you an example. We have a young lady that we had worked with in the past, that was horribly traumatized because of the war in South Sudan. Her job, as many young girls' jobs are in that part of the world, was to go to the well with the jersey can and get water and bring it back to the house. Her mother told her before she went to the well, do not walk the regular path you walk, but go this other direction, because there's soldiers on that path, we have learned, and if you go down that path, you will be raped. So go a different way to get to the well to get the water. Well, being a young girl and not wanting to take the time to go the longer distance, she walked down the path that her mother said not to walk. And she was horribly raped by these soldiers. As she began to tell her trauma story, and she had kept it buried and repressed it for a long time because of the shame. Again, if I can comment, one of the reasons why people don't tell their trauma story is because of the shame associated with it. And so she had avoided it, but as she began to tell it, she began to tell about her belief about men that came out of her trauma story, what happened to her. So she believed that all men were rapists because of what happened to her. You can understand this. She's been traumatized, never talked about it, and the way she coped with understanding the trauma was, oh, all men are rapists. That's why I was raped. Our healer was so good at helping this woman examine that belief by asking her, do you have a father? And the young girl said, yes, I have a father. And our healer asked her, is your father a rapist? And she was offended. She goes, no, of course not. And then she asked her, do you have a brother? She said, yes. Is your brother a rapist? And again she goes, no. And then the healer asked her, are your father and your brother men? And she said, yes, of course. And she suddenly realized all men are not rapists. So that's what we mean when the person tells their trauma story, to look for those distortions of the truth and replace them. That's the teach part. That's number 4. Teach. Replace it with the truth of God. Without getting into it extensively, we do in our level 1 training. Satan takes opportunity through the traumatic event and how the traumatized person interprets it in order to lie to them about God and other people. He doesn't care, that's why this happened to you. He's punishing you, God is. You've sinned against him. All people are bad people, whatever it might be. And then the person will live with that distorted belief system. So as that gets exposed through the trauma story and examined as being a lie, the teaching part is to convey to them the truth of God so they might be healed. When we talk about healing, and how do you heal someone who's traumatized, the 2 most important elements are the person telling their trauma story. The second is the healer. That person needs to be trained, anointed and gifted to hear the trauma story and speak life into it rather than death, to combat the lies of the enemy. Thank you for listening. In our next tape, we're going to talk about what we train in level 2, which has to do with how trauma affects the brain. I hope you watch it with us. Thank you for listening.